Hello, this is Chapter 5, Sexuality, for Sociology 102 Social Problems. Okay, so the chapter starts out by looking at how, sexuality can be understood biologically and culturally, but also just sex itself, right? So sex is that term that we use as a biological distinction between female-bodied and male-bodied people. And when it comes to sex, we understand it culturally as a binary, even though we know there are people who are born intersexed or people that have hormonal differences or chromosomal differences that really challenge that binary thinking of XX equals female and XY equals male. But still, sex is, a biological distinction. And the term sex itself can also refer to activity that leads to sexual gratification or even, potentially reproduction. But the ways that we interpret sex and sexuality have a lot to do with the culture and the time period in which we're in. So when it comes to sex as a cultural issue, there is a lot of norms related to sex, such as, age, marital status, or who your partner is, right? When it comes to age, societies differ when it comes to ages of consent, or in our culture, since we understand that the brain does not finish forming until you're about 25 years old, we've set an age of consent around 18, saying that if someone does engage in sexual activity before that age, they're not developed enough to understand the consequences of these actions and therefore cannot consent fully, right? So we have norms that have been codified into law when it comes to age and sex. When it comes to marital status, some societies are more rigid about, sexual activity only being related to, married partners, but other cultures are more permissive. And we can even see these changes within a culture over time, like within our own culture, as we'll discuss when it comes to the sexual revolution. And when it comes to norms around sex partners, because we have this hegemonic view of heterosexuality in our culture, we consider it to be deviant to, anyone that's involved in same-sex attraction or same-sex activity. It's considered deviant in the culture, even though there's been a lot of progress, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's still this kind of what we call compulsory heterosexuality, or the assumption that everybody's heterosexual. So these kind of belief systems, the culture, the values, the norms, affect the way that we then interpret our own experiences of sex and our own sexual orientations. When looking at sexual attitudes in the United States, it's important to note that the sexual freedoms that the sexual revolution was trying to achieve were really things that were restricted in the past, right, because of the value systems of the particular groups in those time periods. So specifically, the New England Puritans, right, they believed that without strict rules to control people's behavior, the ever-present temptation of sex would lead to unwanted pregnancies, sex outside of marriage, and prostitution. And this kind of puritanical beliefs really undercut a lot of colonial society. And then moving into the Victorian era, there was a lot of shame attached to the body, and especially desire. And so this kind of repressed sex and really said it's something that's taboo, that we should keep hidden, that we shouldn't discuss with others, that's kind of behind closed doors, that we don't talk to children about it. All of these kind of things were really, strictures that largely came from this puritanical ideology and, of course, the Victorian era itself and their kind of sexually repressed belief systems as well. So once you get to the late 1960s, early 70s, you get this kind of, large cultural shift in challenging earlier puritanical notions and creating a new understanding of sexual freedom, right? And so sexual freedom was really uncoupling sexual activity with reproduction so that people could have sex for enjoyment and not just to make children within the context of a heterosexual marriage, right? So the sexual revolution was really about moving away from a double standard. So a double standard is this idea that men are rewarded for sexual activity while women are punished for sexual activity. So that men socially, right, that when you think about men that have a lot of sex, they tend to be venerated. They tend to be people that we celebrate. Even the words that we use, like stud or player, are much more positive in connotation than the words we use when we think a woman has a lot of sex, right? Slut, whore. There's a million more, right, of those words. They all have a negative connotation about women. And so this double standard is the idea that men can have sex before marriage, but women cannot. And, women are really negatively viewed while men are positively viewed through this. And so the sexual revolution was moving away from a double standard and really coupled to feminism, right? The idea that women should have control over their own bodies and that they should have control over their own reproduction. The sexual revolution might not have been possible without the advent of the birth control pill in 1960, which became available in 1960. And of course, there were Supreme Court cases that followed that first allowed for married couples to have access to birth control pill and then subsequently unmarried people. And then, of course, the landmark Roe v. Wade case that allowed for abortion access for U.S. women. So these things happened right after and during that sexual revolution. And they, again, were coupled with second wave of women's rights movement, that type of feminism at the time that was really trying to help women move into more educational pathways, into more career professions outside of the home, into larger social roles, right? Instead of being relegated as mother and wife only. So this sexual revolution was really, coupled with feminist ideology at the time. So by the late 70s, some religious groups, conservative organizations, and conservative political leaders such as Ronald Reagan, who took power in 1980, issued in this counter-revolution, which was basically the conservative reaction to the sexual revolution. They wanted to turn back the clock to reestablish the more puritanical view or moral system that existed before the sexual revolution. So it's interesting, the book talks about how this wasn't successful because most people still think that, people should decide matters of sexual behavior for themselves. But I would argue it has been successful in the fact that there's been more, this counter-revolution, it continues on. So there's been more attacks on Roe v. Wade and access to abortion since 2010 than since 1973. And we've seen in recent years some very strict bills be passed, right? Where sometimes women have to drive, 200 miles in one direction to find the one clinic where they can access care. And they're forced to listen to a fetal heartbeat and then wait 72 hours before they can terminate their pregnancy. And there's no medical necessity for that. That's really just part of the ways in which the laws are trying to be structured to demonize women for having abortions. And in the case of those situations with 72 hours, if someone has to travel 200 miles in one direction, they need a car, they need money for gas or other transportation. And then if you have to wait 72 hours, then you're going to need to stay in a hotel. Plus, the average cost nationally of an abortion is around $700. So the kind of cost financially that it costs to access care makes it pretty much impossible for a lot of women in lower economic situations. Because again, the Hyde Amendment makes it so that, public funds don't go for abortion access or care. So anyway, you also have the more recent Texas law that basically banned abortion after 6 weeks or when a fetal heartbeat can be detected. And this law is very strict. It punishes people. It tries to imprison folks for providing this care. And it also does not offer an exception for rape or incest. So, this is an ongoing issue, right? And I put some information in the additional resources that talk about these kind of further understandings and struggles that, we can see how social values really affect people's perspectives on these kinds of what we call politically wedge issues. And then the book talks about as well what's important to understanding a lot of the kind of diversity in sexual expressions was really Alfred Kinsey in his research in the 1950s that opened a lot of people's eyes to just the diversity of sexual desire and expressions in the United States, because it was really thought that people were much more conservative than they were. But through his research, he found that people had more sexual partners than was thought. They, engaged in more sexual behaviors or activities than was previously thought. And he created a scale, what he called the Kinsey scale of desire. Instead of trying to do a binary of heterosexuality and homosexuality, he gave it a scale. So he found that there was a lot of people that fell in between somewhere on this spectrum. So it was like a scale of 1 to 6. And it's basically, whether or not you'd had same-sex desire, same-sex attraction, things like that, a scale of, heterosexuality to homosexuality. And again, a lot of people were found more in the middle somewhere than at the extremes, much more than was thought. So his research really also helped, kind of fuel part of the sexual revolution, because it happened in a time period where, once the dust settled on his research, less than a decade later comes the sexual revolution. So clearly it had an impact on changing public perceptions, just as the late 70s, religious right movements and, the conservative 1980s Reagan years brought us the counter-revolution that's still raging to this day. And then a continuing revolution for older people is a pretty interesting one they talked about in the book as well. So research has looked at how most older people now remain sexually active well into old age. So if you think about it, it's that same generation that brought us the sexual revolution, the baby boomer generation, is largely in their 60s and 70s at this point. And as they age, they bring with them differing expectations of sexuality and identity. And as a result, they're changing the way that we now understand sexuality at older ages. So especially in our culture, because of media and advertising, we really think of sex as only for the young and attractive, right? Because that's what motivates selling stuff, through all the advertisements. But in reality, that's a part of our identities. And as we age, that still is an important part for us. So it's interesting to see how baby boomers, as such a large generation, and really as a generation who already has broken a lot of boundaries, how they are now changing the definitions of sexual revolution with age. Okay, so moving on to some more definitional terms from the book. Okay, so sexual orientation is just a person's romantic or emotional attraction to another person. So heterosexuality is sexual attraction to someone of a different sex, while homosexuality is sexual attraction to someone of the same sex. And bisexuality is attraction to people of both sexes. So those terms are pretty understood, but less understood is asexuality, which is people that have an absence of sexual attraction. Or nowadays you have terms that have pushed beyond this, such as pansexuality, right? Which just really means someone who, in a kind of conventional way, is bisexual, but also accepts or is interested in folks who are transgender or gender nonconforming or non-binary or, gender fluid. So pretty much removing the specific gender identity restrictions, saying that you're attracted to people of both sexes and all genders. So when we talk about sexual orientation, it's really about our partners. Who is it that we're actually engaging in romantic or sexual behavior with? So homosexuality is something that has been really demonized in our culture for many years. And this is largely because heterosexuality is our cultural norm. It's the hegemony, right? It's, again, that compulsory heterosexuality. We assume everyone's heterosexual in so many ways. And the ways that we organize society are really arranged around heterosexuality, right? So, for instance, if a same-sex couple is getting married, people will say, well, who's going to wear the tux and who's going to wear the dress? As if a same-sex couple has to fit themselves to a heteronormative mold, right? Or to what a heterosexual couple would do. So, our understandings of heterosexuality limit our ability to understand or appreciate differing forms of love or family structure or any of these things, because we've set up this kind of mold that every family has to be put inside of to be understood. So, for many, many years, homosexuals were pushed to the margins of society, and heterosexuality was often considered a social problem by many. And so, this really, from a Western point of view, the West was always trying to understand sex as like a thing that we could look at in a medical lab, right? So when looking at how do we determine sexual orientation, even the term homosexuality and heterosexuality came out of research done in the late 1800s, where they were trying to, kind of understand desire, but in a very clinical sense. So there are biological factors and cultural factors that come into play when determining sexual orientation. So on an individual level, a lot of evidence points to the conclusion that sexual orientation is rooted in human biology, like being left or right-handed. So sexual orientation appears to be largely fixed at birth. But when it comes to the cultural factors, Foucault, in his History of Sexuality book, talks about how societies did not identify homosexuals as a specific category of the population until the late 19th century, again, the late 1800s. And so it's not to say that people in earlier times didn't have same-sex experiences. It's just society did not take note of it and make a term and make it like a different label in a different category. It's actually pretty interesting, even when we talk about the evolution of the term heterosexual itself. When the term first came out, it had a negative stigma because of the time period when, the late 1800s, there was this notion that if a person wanted to or had sexual desire at all, that was a bad thing, whether it be sexual desire towards someone of the same sex or opposite sex. So it wasn't until, these terms became more part of the cultural ether that identities formed around them where people could say, hey, that idea of same-sex desire, that explains my desire, and therefore I can create community based on this term. That's kind of like how it evolved from like a term in a medical textbook to an identity, right? So also when we look at, public perception has changed a lot. And when it comes to inequality and public policy, so much of the inequity in society, some of it is personal, but a lot of it is structural, meaning the ways that laws are structured, the ways that history is played out because of inequalities in the past that haven't been righted. So when looking at, again, public perception of LGBTQIA identifying folks has changed dramatically in the last 30 years, from very little acceptance to majority acceptance. Yet, it's not as if we're there yet. There's still a lot of targeting and hate crimes, and especially when we talk about the trans community, they're very much under attack. Not just on the streets, but also in legislative houses where, bathroom bills and laws to restrict transgender children from playing sports and all sorts of other bans and attacks are being put in place to really further marginalize trans people and specifically these days, trans children. Okay, so looking at some of the ways in which we have changed some of our public understandings about sexual orientation is really same-sex marriage, right? In the U.S., this wasn't legally, accepted across the United States until the Supreme Court decision in 2015. So there were many states where same-sex marriage was legalized, but there were many where it wasn't, right? And there were many restrictions put on people and challenges based on, taxes or getting someone's estate after they die and all sorts of things that were complicated because the whole legal system was set up with the intention of heterosexual couples in mind. So a lot of conservatives opposed the idea of same-sex marriage. They wanted what they call traditional marriage, that is a union between a man and a woman. And so this issue tends to be somewhat legislatively settled at this point, but there are a lot of people that have a problem with it in general. There's been a lot of progress towards not just same-sex marriage protection, but also when it comes to legal protections for adoption and other kind of family protections for LGBTQ families. And this is all the result of the gay rights movement. So basically, you know, one example is same-sex marriage, but there's been a lot of other successes that have come out of this mobilized campaign for more rights and equity in the culture through the gay rights movement, you know, to this day. So a lot of this starts with Stonewall, right? The Stonewall Inn. There was this thing that was called the Stonewall Riot, basically, in 1969. These patrons of this bar that were always getting raided by the cops, because at the time they had a lot of laws that controlled like what clothes you could even wear, right, as your gender expression. And basically part of the liquor license laws said that you couldn't have any homosexuals in your establishment. So these gay bars were often the only places that people could actually be with other people that were also same-sex identified and not be targeted or harassed or threatened. So these were important cultural spaces. And the cops kept raiding this bar over and over. And one night, you know, a couple people stood up and, you know, very notably, some trans and drag queens like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha B. Johnson, and also some, you know, gay street kids that would hang out at the Stonewall. They basically stood up to the cops and said no, they wouldn't show their IDs, they wouldn't consent to the searches. And what started out as, you know, a small tuffle became a huge conflict, which we now call the Stonewall Riot or the Stonewall Uprising, where, you know, which culminated in a couple nights of protests, sustained protests and rioting, which then led to the first gay pride parade. Whereas if you watch the film Stonewall Uprising, they actually talk about how a lot of the guys who were there called it the first gay pride run, because everyone was very worried about their safety and they didn't think that it would last or they'd be able to get through the whole parade route. So anyway, the Stonewall Uprising was a real turning point in creating a larger sense of community and starting this kind of gay pride movement and moving past homophobia, right, which is the aversion or hostility towards people that are thought to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And so this concept really reinforced the idea that the problem is not homosexuality, but the people who are intolerant of homosexuality is the problem, right? Because remember, before Stonewall happened, people could not be out, right? Like if you got caught, people would put your name in the newspaper with your address, right? So people could be harassed or harmed. People lost their jobs if they were outed. They couldn't do military service, all sorts of things. People were restricted from social life and even in some cases institutionalized and put through what's called conversion therapy, in some cases involving electroshock treatment, and at the most extreme cases, lobotomies, meaning carving out a part of the frontal lobe of somebody and then saying, well, now they're not homosexual anymore. It's like, yeah, but now they're also a vegetable, right? They can only sit there and drool. So, you know, at the time, the ideology of the DSM, or the, you know, American Psychological Association's, you know, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders, they listed homosexuality as a mental disease through, you know, the early 70s. So as a result of this, you know, it was kind of medically justified to create prejudice. So again, this is what I'm talking about how prejudice and bias gets institutionalized, right? It gets put into the way we understand psychology. It gets put into the laws that are put in place that target homosexuals, like the liquor license law or whatever it might be. So the gay rights movement was really successful in pushing back against these things, and really important for the HIV/AIDS issue in the 1980s. Groups like ACT UP that came together to really point out the government's ineptitude and terrible response in preventing or dealing with the AIDS epidemic, largely because it was targeting IV drug users and same-sex communities more so than other communities at first. So they thought, well, who cares, right? These were marginal people. And as a result, you know, many, many people needlessly died. So, you know, the gay rights movement had a lot of successes in bringing attention to a lot of issues that were specifically affecting LGBTQ plus people and their families. And then, of course, now we have the transgender movement as well. So transgender is a broad concept that just refers to appearing or behaving in ways that challenge conventional cultural norms concerning how females and males should look or should act. So transgender, remember, gender is different than sexual identity, right? Gender identity is your internalized sense of, your own gender, or what, your own gender identity within the context of our societal meaning of gender in like this weird binary that we live in, where you're supposed to be male or female, right? Sometimes people feel that they aren't male or female, right? Or sometimes people feel like their assigned sex at birth does not represent their internalized sense of gender identity. So that's different from being heterosexual or homosexual or who you desire, your internalized sense of gender. So anyway, this transgender movement has really been pushing past the idea of gender as a binary and saying that, we should challenge these binary assumptions in the culture and allow for people to have more expression in their dress, in how they act and how they talk and how they do everything without having to fear being targeted, being harassed, or even, especially for a lot of trans women of color, being killed. Moving on to sexuality, inequality, and controversy. Pornography refers to words or images intended to cause sexual arousal. Laws regulate certain types of pornography, including the depiction of sexual violence and sexual acts with children. But what are the effects of viewing pornography? In research, there's estimates that about 90% of men and 33% of women view pornography regularly, and that heavy viewing of pornography in other research has been shown to distort sexual development so that an individual may have difficulty responding to a real-life partner. So to kind of illustrate this, I put a video in your additional resources that talks a little bit about one man's experience and how it affected his own internalized sense of desire. So I put that in there for you to kind of, reiterate that point. But it is interesting nowadays too that because of smartphones and access to pornography through the internet, a lot of young people develop their sense of self and their, first understandings of sexuality from pornography instead of from interactions with peers. And this can be very problematic if pornography is incredibly biased and violent and, rife with all sorts of prejudices and problems. So when it comes to pornography and violence, there was a commission put together in the 80s under Reagan, and of course a lot of research since, concluded that exposure to pornography causes sexual arousal, increases people's sexual activity, and encourages men to be aggressive and more accepting of violent acts such as rape. So does that mean pornography is a social problem? Well, in some ways, when we're talking about child pornography, absolutely, right? But there is also the concern of what is the effect of pornography on adults and their adult relationships. So conservatives look at the moral issue. Conservatives view sex as moralistic, emphasizing the importance of personal responsibility and public decency, while liberals really look at issues of freedom and power. So they defend the freedom of expression and people's right to privacy when it comes to their sexual desires. So what's interesting too is, your book talks about how feminist liberals tend to object to pornography as demeaning to women, largely because they see pornography as a power issue, noting that sexually explicit material often depicts women as objects or playthings, or again, in that additional content, he calls it sex with no hands, is basically what he calls it. That, the actual connection between people that happens within, sexual interactions kind of gets diminished into almost like a commodity form. And so obviously, in that way, it could be viewed as a social problem. Okay, looking at sexual harassment. So sexual harassment involves unwanted comments, gestures, or physical contact of a sexual nature. Some of these are quid pro quo, right, which just means one thing for another in Latin. So this is the kind of harassment that occurs when a person directs sexual advances or requests sexual favors from like an employee or someone else who's a subordinate as a condition of their job or advancement, right? To say like, well, if you want that promotion, then you have to have sex with me, or if you want to keep your job, you have to, perform this sexual favor or something like that. And the second type of harassment is more subtle. And this is why we need those trainings that we all have before we go into workplace settings, which is, the second form of harassment is about, creating a hostile environment, meaning, telling sexual jokes or displaying nude photos, engaging in unnecessary touching, or offering compliments based on someone's body or how they look. And so what's interesting and important about this too is that it's not about the offender intending to harass in the case of that second type of harassment. It doesn't matter what the intention was, it matters what the recipient felt. And so, someone can be harassing regardless of their intent, right? Because if the behavior has the effect of creating a hostile environment, then it is sexual harassment. And, I think if you haven't heard of the Anita Hill case, there's an excellent documentary that really dives into the public consciousness understanding of sexual harassment that came to a head thanks to, the Anita Hill trial. Well, it's basically, you could call it a trial, but basically the Anita Hill hearings when Clarence Thomas was being nominated to the Supreme Court. There's a great documentary on Netflix if you want to know more about that. Okay, so when looking at, who harasses who in those cases, oftentimes, men tend to, in some research they found that men sexually harass other men who do not display what harassers think as typical masculine behavior. So sometimes sexual harassment can be a form of control used by men to force other men to conform to gender stereotypes. So it's not just an idea of, a heterosexual context where men are harassing women. Anyone can be the victim of sexual harassment. And so the Supreme Court ruled that employees can be victims of harassment even if they were not obviously harmed by, let's say, losing a promotion. It's, having to work in a hostile environment or, having to be the recipient of unwanted comments or gestures or touching or anything like that is what is considered harassment. Okay, so when it comes to prostitution is the selling of sexual services that may be the world's oldest profession, and it's always been controversial. So when it comes to prostitution, prostitutes are a diverse category, right? Some have much better than other working conditions, depending on their, degree of physical attractiveness, age, social class, position. You have people that are very expensive escorts, and then you have people that are working on the street. So when it comes to arrest for prostitution, although prostitution is against the law almost everywhere in the U.S., law enforcement's pretty selective, and the problem tends to be that the women who are selling sex, or it's not always women, right, but the people who are selling sex can often be the ones who are targeted for arrest and not those who are buying sex, which is very different than other cultures where oftentimes selling sex itself has been legalized, but buying sex is still illegal. So it kind of goes with the person trying to buy it as the one who goes to jail. So, cultures vary and differ when it comes to the ways that they understand or allow for prostitution, right? There's many developed nations that are similar to our own, but they have more regulated senses of prostitution, meaning they've legalized it in some sense so that prostitutes are able to have protection from the state, are able to make sure they're not, hurt or killed or harassed or raped or any of the kind of other horrible things that can come along with working within that trade. And, they get tested, they get medical support, they get all the things that they need so that they can, be sex workers. So our culture, of course, is a bit more still hung on to that puritanical ideology, so we are definitely not in support of such things, but there have been a lot of research comparing, health outcomes and STD rates and all sorts of things, and showing a lot of positives that can come from a more legalized, regulated sense of prostitution. But again, that's, who knows what our culture will do. That's what's always so interesting about it, is it's dynamic and it can change, right, depending on how public sentiment or ideologies change. But a huge problem that still exists is child prostitution and sex trafficking. So around the world, hundreds of thousands of children, most of them boys, end up living on the street, and they end up selling sex to survive. And some of these children work to provide income for their families. while others, get orphaned by war or other factors and end up in these terrible situations. And so, there's also the issue that there's a lot of sex tourism to certain areas of the globe to target younger and younger children. There's a really good documentary I used in another class called Half the Sky you can find from PBS, and it's really heartbreaking, some of the stories that happen there. But they have this story about, child sex trafficking in Bangladesh. And it's basically, talking about the horrors of a lot of the brothels where kids are sold into at a very young age, sometimes even as toddlers. And the story focuses on this woman who, herself, she escaped sex trafficking. And, she turned her life around and she created almost like literally a village, a school, a whole situation to support other young women leaving that situation. And she would go on raids to like liberate women from brothels where they're like being locked inside and, they're 15 years old or much younger in a lot of cases. And she took them all in, gave them educations, fed them, you know what I mean? And it's just such a beautiful story of how like one person can make such a strong, huge, lasting impact when combating things in their own community that are really terrible and seem insurmountable. So again, if you haven't seen it, I really highly recommend Half the Sky. There's a lot of different segments within that film that are really powerful, but that's one of them that really kind of looks at this. Or even there's another one about intergenerational prostitution in India and how do you break those loops. So anyway, this is a huge problem around the world, but within the United States as well. We take for granted that this happens, but, tens of thousands of children go through this process here as well. And so we need to be more vigilant and understanding about this, but also, understand that the demand that drives this is a big problem, and that the financial networks that undercut it, these kind of, seedy, seemly things, there's a lot of money involved in sex trafficking. And so this continues to proliferate, even with, FBI and everybody else trying to track and stop the problem. Okay, another social problem, kind of related, is teen pregnancy and parenthood. So in recent decades, the pregnancy rate among teen girls has fallen substantially, despite the fact that at least half of teenage girls and boys are sexually active. But the main reason for the decline is really the increased use of contraceptives among sexually active teens. So that's kind of goes back to, the idea of sex education as something that's important, right? So anyway, but when we look at the rates of teen pregnancies, they're still much higher in the US than they are in other developed nations that are similar to us. And so that still might be the result of some of our belief systems and values, and also when it comes to the kind of comprehensive sex education that we're providing, or in most cases not providing comprehensive sex education. And when children receive not just comprehensive, but like LGBTQIA, inclusive sex education, we know in research that this leads to less unwanted pregnancies, less STDs and STIs, less dating violence, and other, negative behaviors. So, it can be really helpful. The book talks about whether sex education is the solution to teen pregnancy, right? Because these programs can teach young people about how their bodies grow and change and how to avoid pregnancy, not just by abstaining, but by using, safe sex practices. And it's just the problem is there's a stigma in our culture that says if we teach kids about sex, they'll have sex. But in reality, they have the internet. And by the time you're a teenager, you already know more about it than, is coming from your health class. So, having these things can be very, at least in the research that's been documented, can really reduce a lot of negative outcomes for young adults. When it comes to the cost of teen pregnancy, for men and women who are young and poor, parenthood can bring a level of responsibility and economic pressure that they can't really handle, right? So when you look for, the costs of, how much it costs to live how much medical care costs, how much all of these kind of things. If you're a teenager and you have very little education, it's very difficult to get a good job that pays well. And, that means if you're poor, it's going to be very difficult to manage. So it's interesting, when we look at the babies that are born to teen mothers, there are some parallels there. And the issue really is that it's interesting. Being born to a teenage parent will not necessarily make you poor. It's just that, as we all saw through the show, 16 and Pregnant and Teen Mom, right? A lot of those girls are very wealthy. They did not go into poverty because of their child. Of course, they were also getting paid by MTV, right? But it's really the fact that, if you're already in poverty when you have this child, it becomes extremely difficult to get out. If you are already kind of middle class, it's much easier, or wealthy, definitely easier to navigate a teen pregnancy, right? Because you have more resources to lean on when you don't have those same supports, like getting through high school, and all of those things can be really difficult when you have a teen pregnancy if you don't have a support system to help you, right? Paying for childcare is incredibly expensive, healthcare, all of it. So, making sure that teens know what they're doing can really help prevent unwanted pregnancies. So again, is sex education the solution? Well, some people say yeah, because a lot of the sex education that we have is very limited in scope, right? Like, I know mine was a health class where they give you like a cross section of anatomy and say, hey, label this, label that. Here's where the fallopian tube is. That doesn't really teach you about consent to prevent rape and, other harassment. It doesn't teach you about, what a healthy relationship looks like, or, kind of how to prevent dating violence. It doesn't teach you, a lot of positive, it's not very sex positive. It's very like abstinence, or you're going to end up with a baby. And as a result, and again, it's also not often very LGBTQIA affirming, meaning it kind of ignores the presence or experience or existence of people with different sexual identities. So that education is just not comprehensive. And as a result, it fails to really adequately prepare a lot of youth for the perils of sexual activity. So again, looking now at abortion, obviously, abortion is the intentional termination of a pregnancy. And there's really always been a controversy when it comes to abortion, right? Because some folks see it as murder, and other folks see it as, an ability to make choices over their own body, right? Where's the line between a woman's, her rights and the baby's rights? Where is that line, right? Where does the baby's rights become more important than the woman's rights? So that's the real key, actually, that a lot of litigation will be done in the Supreme Court about some of these restrictive abortion laws that have gone into place in recent years, as I mentioned earlier. So the controversy today is increasing, right? There's such an intense controversy over abortion. So, basically, people that are anti-abortion, they claim that abortion is murder, right? So, but then again, pro-choice activists are also saying, well, this is the access and control over your own body and your own life. So those are really strong positions on both sides, and as a result, there's not a lot of leeway in between. So people tend to fall into one camp or the other, right? And it's the distinction has to be made really briefly here between, we talk about pro-choice or pro-life is what it's called, right? It's such great marketing to say pro-life, because what's the opposite of life? Death. If you're pro-life, if you're not pro-life, you're pro-death, right? It's great marketing, but it's also very underhanded. It's not really fully telling you the story, because how can you be pro-life if you support the death penalty, right? Or war, or any of those things? You're not, right? But pro-life would mean life in every context. It'd be like being a vegan, right? It wouldn't be, pro-birth is very different, right? Because if you're pro-birth, you think the baby should be born. But if you're very conservative and very on the anti-abortion side, then you often also don't support financial programs for the poor, such as, food assistance or welfare programs of really any kind. And that's what's really needed when babies are born, so that babies can be fed, have roofs over their head, food in their bellies, and, safe environments to thrive in. So a lot of people really kind of question this idea of pro-life as really pro-birth, because it's really more about having the baby than it is about, does that baby get a high quality education for free? No, right? When that's just considered normal in a lot of other developed countries. So when we look around the world, we can see how cultural variation is important. And we have to look then at our own cultural values to say, how is our culture different, and why is it that we end up in a different place than a lot of other cultures when it comes to whether it's abortion or any of these other issues? Okay, looking at sexually transmitted infections. So STIs are diseases spread by sexual contact. So you have your typical ones like gonorrhea or syphilis that can cause, sterility. Syphilis can cause blindness and mental disorders. There's the very famous Tuskegee syphilis study that was done for decades. And it was a very unethical study that was done to try and determine if there were differences. So the researcher, let me back up. The researcher's assumption was that there would be a difference between white people and African American people when it came to repercussions of syphilis. So they basically tested men that already had syphilis and did not treat their syphilis. And only about 15 years after the study started, they found a great treatment for syphilis, but they didn't give it to any of these men. And instead they studied them over a couple decades until a whistleblower told the media what was happening in the 70s, and then they finally shut down the program. But for years, they were treating people for quote-unquote bad blood, but it was really syphilis, and they weren't treating them. They were trying to test the long-term negative effects, such as dying, which happened to a lot of people. And a lot of people in the study passed on syphilis to their partners, and then through childbirth to their children. So very unethical research, right? But that was done and funded by the US government. So it makes sense why, especially in communities of color, you would be hesitant to believe the government, especially when it comes to medical stuff, because of the history of these kinds of very unethical studies. Another very common STI is genital herpes, right, which is a virus that infects about 25 million people in the US, or 1 in 6, right, of people between the ages of 14 and 49. And then, of course, AIDS, right, is caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, which destroys the body's immune system. So AIDS itself doesn't kill us. It makes a person unable to fight off a wide range of other diseases that eventually cause death, often like pneumonia or things like this. So, government officials, are still finding, are still recording thousands of HIV/AIDS deaths in the US. And when it comes to different racial ethnic communities, African American and Latinx communities have higher risks of HIV infection, and this is especially true for women. So this problem isn't just a US problem, obviously, it's a problem around the world. HIV affects over 36 million people around the world, 2.1 million of which are under the age of 15, and those numbers are just increasing. And countries with the highest rates of HIV infections are in sub-Saharan Africa, which accounts for 64% of the world's cases. And again, when you look at the cultural understandings within sub-Saharan Africa, there's very few rights for women to control their own body or use contraceptives, such as, or prophylactics like condoms that would prevent the spread of AIDS, right? So again, in that film Half the Sky, they travel to this area in sub-Saharan Africa and, really look at the issues of maternal mortality, the AIDS crisis, and all that kind of stuff. Again, can't recommend it higher. So, HIV, it can progress and it can be transmitted not just from person to person, through sexual activity, but it can also be through, blood transfusions. That's the way that a lot of people got it in the early days of HIV/AIDS as well, before hospitals realizes that people could be, let's say you get in a car accident, you need a blood transfusion, and someone donated blood not knowing that they were HIV positive, that blood transfusion could then make that person sick with AIDS as well. And it can also be transmitted through breast milk, right? As an infected mother feeds her baby, she's also infecting this baby. So, of course, HIV is not transmitted through casual contact. Like in the early days of HIV, there was a big fear that like if you shook someone's hands or gave them a hug or I don't know, they sneezed at you or something, that you, or if you like swam in the same pool together, that somehow you would get sick as well. And that's just not the case. There was a huge, fear tactic at the time. But, certain things do put people at higher risk, like anal sex or sharing needles, especially, really any drug use. And sharing of needles is going to increase your likelihood of, transmitting all sorts of diseases. So when it comes to combating AIDS, in recent years, new drug therapies have extended the lives of people with HIV. And antiretroviral therapies have improved the health and the lifestyles of people with HIV. So meaning, if you take certain drugs, like there's one called PrEP, for instance, but there's a few that have been developed since, they can prevent someone who has the disease themselves from passing it on to a partner as long as they take that medication. So that's a really incredible step. And there have been some, at least in research findings, some really, really important breakthroughs that have happened as to there being a cure eventually. But, those things take a lot of time clinically to develop. So it'll still be some time. But even when that happens, we have to think about, well, who's going to actually have access to those drugs? Who has them now, right? People in Western countries, people with wealth, not people in sub-Saharan Africa that are dying from this in crazy rates, right? So we then have to, again, look at power and privilege and how medicine then gets distributed and how we actually end up combating AIDS. Because if we don't look at it as a global issue, we're not going to eradicate the problem. Okay, so what are some theories of sexuality? So functionalism, or structural functional analysis, looks at controlling sexuality. So they say the most basic function of sexuality is human reproduction, which is a necessary process that allows our species to exist. So they look at how, when it comes to, legitimacy or incest, these are things that show how sexuality is controlled. So the incest taboo, right, is the norm found in pretty much every society. There's very few universals across societies, but one of them is that you're not supposed to, have sex with a family member. I guess except for Game of Thrones, right? There was all sorts of that. But incest taboos are the norm across cultures, across time. That's pretty interesting, right? Considering the biological issues that are there as well, right? So, that sex and reproduction should not happen between family members. And there's also this traditional norm that defines a legitimate child as a child who's born to a married couple, right? It's a societal structure that's put into place basically to ensure that children are cared for within established families with legal ties, including rights of inheritance to their biological parents. But in a lot of ways, some would argue that ignores the privilege inherent in that, is that not everyone has that opportunity to have an established family with legal ties. Such as a same-sex family, where for many years that just wasn't the case. Also, they would look at different functions of things that we consider social problems. So like, what's the function of prostitution? They would say that the function of prostitution is one way to meet the sexual needs of the members of society who aren't married, basically, or don't have ready access to sex. So this could be soldiers, travelers, or other people who for whatever reason are unable to attract a partner. So they would see that as like a function of prostitution, is to kind of create a space for people that otherwise, don't have access to sex. So, again, functionalism is always looking at how things function or dysfunction, right? Symbolic interaction is different. They're always looking at how we interact with each other and make meaning. So they're looking at defining sexuality. So symbolic interaction theory highlights the fact that members of society socially construct sexuality, just as they create all other aspects of reality. So for instance, this whole meaning of virginity, right? The changing meanings attached to sex is the idea of virginity, right? The state of never having sex, And through most of this nation's history, strong cultural norms demanded that people, or more precisely women, remain virgins until marriage. So even the meanings of these things, again, have cultural notions behind them that affect the way that we then interact and the way we, interpret and internalize cultural values. So there's also learning sexual roles. So there was a case study in the book, a case of topless dancers, and it was looking at 40 topless dancers in a southwestern city. Researchers found that women came to that kind of work gradually, step by step, just as other people enter other careers. And almost all the women that were working as topless dancers learned to see their work as useful. And they pointed out that they provided entertainment, that they didn't harm anyone, and that they were getting paid well for what they were doing. So the meaning of it to themselves was defining it as valuable. So that's kind of the way that, symbolic interaction is always looking at meanings, while social conflict analysis is going to often look at power structures and who has and who doesn't, right? So and of course, under this banner of conflict theory is feminist theory and queer theory. So social conflict theory highlights social inequality. Following this approach, feminist theory explains that sexuality involves inequality between women and men. Similarly, queer theory highlights inequality between, heterosexuals and people with other sexual identities. So feminist theory often points out that women are considered sex objects in the culture, and that sexuality plays a part in men's domination of women. Pornography, prostitution, or even the topless dancing example, degrade women, cast them in a role of sexual object that exists primarily for men's pleasure. Not in that analysis is a woman's autonomy, her own strength, or doing something for her own pleasure, right? She just exists to delight the male audience, right? Queer theory really is a body of theory and research that challenges the heterosexual bias in U.S. society. So through queer theory, we get the term heterosexism. And heterosexism is bias that treats heterosexuality as the norm, while stigmatizing anyone who violates this norm as being queer, and as a result, limiting their social interactions, their social values. And so, as we talked about before with the history of this in our own culture, conflict theory always, though, is going to look at it in who benefits from the power system as it is, and who is marginalized through that power system. Okay, so turning lastly to politics, right? Constructing problems and defining solutions. So when it comes to conservatives and the far right, there's this value of traditional morality. The basic principle that defines the conservative view is that people should be guided not by their desires, but by moral principles of right or wrong. And so overall, the conservative answer to social problems involving sexuality is to have strong social institutions, including churches, schools, and especially families in a very traditional heteronormative context. Liberals look at sex and individual choice. So liberals emphasize individual freedom, and as liberals see it, all people should be free to choose how they express their sexuality. This makes the liberal attitude towards sexuality one of tolerance. Believing that individuals should be responsible for their own behavior, liberals support making abortion available to all and leaving the decisions about abortion to the woman herself. Most liberals support government funding for abortions so that pregnant women, regardless of their ability to pay, would have choices. When looking at the radical left, they say you got to go to the root of the problem, right? You got to pluck it by the root. That's what they're always saying. So they say that because sexism and heterosexism are deeply rooted in the existing system, radical feminism advocates change in the direction of a gender-free society, right? Moving past the concept of gender and the gender binary. Similarly, queer theory argues that equality for people of all sexual orientations will require a basic change in our culture. So going on from here, in the span of just a few years, more than, basically in 2015, you went from just a few years before that, less than half of states, or just a little over half of states, having same-sex marriage to all states because of the Obergefell versus Hodges decision in 2015 that said same-sex couples could marry everywhere in the U.S. Such a short period of time to have such radical changes. So we can see, with the changes in 2021 and even the current controversies over abortion right now, just how much these things are in flux and change, and our social definitions have a lot to do with how they change and how they come about. So, how we will understand and construct these things in the future is really going to depend on what happens between now and then, and how our social values change or shift in that time period as well.